traditional approach, and then we'll try to understand the context of the literature. And then in last 5 minutes or so, I'll try to make the detectors of SWOT approach maybe a little bit lenient towards SWOT. And then we will end by looking at from where do you go from here? What are the future directions that we have from as far as our understanding of acid-base imbalance in a biological system goes? We are all conversant with the traditional approach. That in the traditional approach, we know. Yeah. In traditional approach, we all know that the pH of a biological solution, again, when we mean biological solution, in this discussion, we will mean extracellular fluid without, without making any distinction between interstitium or plasma or inside the erythrocyte. When we talk about the pH of a extracellular fluid, it is governed by the ratio of bicarbonate to the ratio of carbon dioxide or the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, and which is given to us by the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation, which is nothing but the negative logarithmic representation of the bicarbonic acid equilibrium. We all know the roles played by different organs in controlling as well as contributing to the change of pH in the extracellular fluid. And we have been learning that this is how compensation occurs, and this is the magnitude of compensation. By this time, we have by heart those formulas. And if we see pH, we see that pH is a ratio of bicarbonate to carbon dioxide. So it is regarded that the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, it represents the respiratory component. There is nothing new in this, right? And the bicarbonate, it represents the metabolic component. But because bicarbonate itself depends on the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, so bicarbonate may not be the true representative marker of the metabolic component. So when we understood that there are some limitations of using bicarbonate as a marker of metabolic, representation of the metabolic deviance, whereas other new analytical parameters has been put forward to, like the buffer base, then the base excess and its derivative like standard base excess or base excess in the ECF. Now, whether it's a standard bicarbonate or standard pH or base excess or standard base excess, so what does that do? They actually represent the net effect of the acidifying and alkalinizing factors that are happening in that biological system. It does not tell us this is the acidifying system or this is the alkalinizing mechanism that is going on, and it do not tell us about the magnitude. So to overcome those issues, at least to understand the metabolic acidosis, the anion gap or the anion gap corrected to albumin or anion gap corrected to phosphate, they have been put forwarded to. Sorry, my slide is not moving. Yeah. Then in 1978 and subsequently in 1980, Peter Stewart published his landmark papers, where he postulated that the pH of a solution is not determined by the bicarbonic acid equilibrium. The pH of a solution is determined mainly by 3 independent variables. The one is the strong ion difference. Strong ion difference is nothing but the constant difference of concentration of strongly dissociated cation, for example, sodium, calcium, magnesium, potassium in a biological system, to that of the strongly dissociated anion, that is like chlorine and lactate in a biological system. So it is the difference of the concentration of the strong cations and anions that actually influences the pH of the solution, so that it it maintains the electronegativity of the solution. Apart from the strong anions and cations, the biological system may have certain weak non-volatile acid. In case of plasma, it is albumin inorganic phosphate. That moiety that influences pH has been denoted as A thought by Peter Stewart. And and we all know that it is the partial pressure of carbon dioxide which also influences the pH of the solution. So unlike the previous approach, what Peter Stewart suggested that it is a strong ion difference, the total inorganic weak acid, as well as the partial pressure of carbon dioxide of that biological system that actually determines the pH of that system. What he told us that these independent variables, these 3 independent variables actually determines the concentration of hydrogen ion and bicarbonate ion and other weak ion. So Peter Stewart told us that hydrogen ion or bicarbonate ion is not at the center of the acid-base imbalance. That was quite radical, or is it so? Now, art before Copernicus, everybody thought that art is the center of the universe. And before the landmark papers published by Peter Stewart, everybody thought that a bicarbonate acid equilibrium, which can be mathematically denoted by the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation, is at the center of acid-base universe. But after publications by Copernicus, everybody started to believe that no, it is not Earth, it is the sun which is at the center of the universe. That is the heliocentric model of the universe. And after the landmark publication by Peter Stewart, people started to gradually accept, at least a section of people started to gradually accept that it is the interplay of the three independent variables. That is a strong ion difference, the A dot, and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide that determines the pH of a solution. So it became the center of the universe. Now we know that Copernicus was not true. Sun is not the center of the universe. Actually, Sun is the center of a solar system. Now let's see what happens to the understanding of Peter Stewart, whether it remains at the center of the acid-base universe or not. That is a thing that we need to look for in future. Now this is a snapshot of the original article which was published by Peter Stewart in 1978. When I was a PG student, I tried to have a look into it, and so many equations, it simply blown me away. And I thought that I am never going to understand Stewart approach, and I am not going to read it. So for around 1 year or so, I remained detached from Peter Stewart approach. But subsequently, I realized that it is not as tough as we think it is. We all know the contribution of Thomas J. Morgan. He has written extensively and he has done extensive research that helped us or that shaped our understanding of acid base. Even a person like him, in very recently, which probably in 2019, he said that clinicians are unlikely to find strong ion difference, that is the Peter Stewart approach, or a top-down version of that approach. The albumin-corrected anion gap is in current use and is easily determined by the mental arithmetic from point of care anion gap printout. So he said that no, the Stewart approach is not going to give us any advantage. So that actually decreases our confidence on the Peter Stewart approach. Now, on the other hand, there are some other researchers or scholars who have straight away said, no, Stewart approach should replace traditional bicarbonate-centered model. So there are two schools of thought. One says, no, we should not use it. It does not give us any advantage. And the other school of thought says, no, it should be used. And it is not only two school of thought. There is another school of thought that says, no, both of these approaches have got problem. So that actually has left us, at least me, definitely more confused whether to use Stewart approach, whether not to use Stewart approach. So what to do? It's a very famous saying by Stephen King. He said that sooner or later, everything old is new again. Now, if you look into what is the definition of acid, what is an acid? In 1980s, acid was thought to be something that increases the hydrogen ion concentration in a solution. Then subsequently by Noonan, if I can pronounce his name correctly, with due respect, maybe in and around 1902 or 1908, he suggested that no, acid is a substance that, it's a strong anion and base is a substance which is a strong cation, because he used the concept of Faraday's. Again, subsequently, in a few years later on, the new theory about acid base came, and they suggested no, acid is a substance that donates a proton and base is a substance that accepts a proton, that is a hydrogen ion. So if you see the definition of acid, if we regard hydrogen ion donation or acceptance is as a definition of acid base ion, acid base status, then the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation holds true. And if you think that no, acid is some substance that is going to give a anion, and base is a substance that is going to give a cation, then the concept of Peter Stewart holds true. Now, so that's why I think that as we keep on changing our understanding of what is basically an acid, the concepts around it and the explanation of the acid-base status of a biological solution is bound to change. So I think this line by Stephen King that sooner or later everything old is new again is very apt. Now, those who are naysayers of Stewart, they say, no, Stewart approach is very complex. It includes so many polynomial equations. So I don't want to carry a laptop near to the patient. Even I thought when I was a PG that I would have to carry a laptop near a patient. In those days, we did not have smartphones. So as to understand or at least do the calculations for, to analyze an ABC according to Peter Stewart approach. And the standard basic test, which we very commonly use, it reflects the whole body and it also incorporates the change of or the influence of hemoglobin. Whereas the strong ion difference, which is one of the most important, but it's on the plasma. Peter Stewart did not give us an idea about what is the influence of SID of interstitial fluid or what is the influence of SID inside the the cytoplasm of the RBC. Now, SID is calculated for multiple measurements because we have to measure sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, then chlorine, so when we use so many measurements, SID, there is bound to accumulation of measurement errors. And the standard basic excess that we have been using, or even the bicarbonate that we have been using, it has fitted quite well for our day-to-day clinical practice. So for determining acid base status in the clinical practice. So we are a bit reluctant to use Stewart approach. Now, those who says that Stewart approach is complex, but this very beautiful article by Story et al. Story in 2016, he has brought Peter Stewart to bedside. What he did is that he considered the three independent that influence the pH of the solution according to Stewart approach. The one is the strong ion difference, and the most abundant ions that determine strong ion difference is the sodium and chlorine. So that is the reason why in the first, to measure the acidifying or alkalizing effect of the concentration of sodium and chlorine, he has given us this formula: measured sodium minus measured chlorine minus 35. Whatever the value is, if it is plus, that means it has got. If value sodium and chlorine and an acidifying effect on the solution. Now he considered the acidifying contribution of lactate, and he has given it by the formula 1 minus measured lactate, where lactate is measured in milliequivalent per liter. So suppose your measured lactate is 4, that means 1 minus 4 is minus 3. So the acidification is given by lactate is minus 3 milliequivalent per liter. Now we all know that albumin along with inorganic phosphate is the main consequence of the weak acid, that is the ATOT. And for most of the practical data pH that we see, inorganic phosphate is more or less normal, except in few other situations. So he has considered only albumin, and to note the acidifying effect of albumin, he has given this very simple formula: 0.25 into 42 minus measured albumin. The albumin is gram per. So that gives you the acidifying effect. It is a minus if the value is minus, and it gives an alkalizing effect if the value is plus. Now we all know that the acidification effect of a solution, it depends on the difference than the lactate, then the albumin, and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide has already been taken care of. So the total acidification or amount of base that is needed to bring the pH to
Dr. Saurabh, is there some sound issue from Dr. Priyam?
Try to contact him.
Slow connection is the base excess. First equation plus the second.
Priyam, there is some problem in your network. No? Priyam, we can't hear you.
Hello.
Am I back? Am I back?
Now you're audible, but
Okay,
we can hear you again, Dr. Priyam. Yeah, please carry on.
Pardon?
Please show your screen.
Okay. Can I continue now?
Show your screen, please.
Please carry on. Please carry on.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. I'm so sorry about it. Yeah. So basically, this very interesting paper by Story, it has brought Peter Stuart to near to bedside. So when we decide whether to use any specific approach or not, whether to use the traditional approach or whether to use the Peter Stuart approach, what we are trying to see. I mean, why to use any of the specific approaches? I'll be using any specific approach if the results of the specific approach may be clinically attractive compared to the other one. If that approach effectively separates...
Dr. Saurabh, the screen share, please.
Priyam, please show your screen.
The screen is not visible.
Yeah, not visible.
Can you just give me...
Let's share the screen again.
Yeah. I'm so sorry about it. Is it visible now?
Yeah, you're visible. You're okay.
Yeah. I'm so sorry about it. There are some network issues. Now, why shall I be using any specific approach, whether it's a traditional approach or whether it's the Peter Stuart approach? I'll be using any approach if the results of one approach is clinically attractive to me, or if it effectively separates the sick from the healthy, if it narrows down the diagnostic possibilities, and if it tells us the sickness, the severity of the sickness, so that we can take a management decision. So we will try to understand we'll try to compare traditional approach and the Peter Stuart approach on these 4 headings. So whenever we are measuring or analyzing an ABC, what are we basically trying to understand? We're trying to understand the respiratory component, which is very clear to us by the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. And we're trying to understand the metabolic component, either by your standard bicarbonate or base excess or standard base excess or anion gap, etc. We use anion gap and corrected anion gap or the strong anion gap, which is proposed by Peter Stuart, basically to look for unmeasured ion. And if we can identify the presence of unmeasured ion, and we see whether it has led to an acidification or a basification of the whole blood sample that we are analyzing, it actually will help us to come to a diagnosis as well as to understand what is happening. Okay. So what is happening here is that what is happening here is that that there's a very close correlation between base excess and strong ion difference, and there's a very close correlationship between albumin corrected anion gap and strong ion gap. So the authors try to say that whether we are using a base excess or whether you are using an corrected anion gap according to the traditional approach, or we are using strong ion difference or strong ion gap according to the Peter Stuart approach, we are actually measuring the same thing and to the same amount. So it really does not make a difference whether we are using the traditional method or the Peter Stuart method. It is a very interesting paper that came out, I think, this year only, where the authors, they have infused the patient with a known amount of unmeasured ion, acetate and gluconate, because the patients were on cardiopulmonary bypass. And then they tried to measure the predictive ability of different representative of the metabolic component to identify those unmeasured ions. Those unmeasured ions were known as gluconate and acetate. So they measured the bicarbonate, they measured the anion gap, they measured the albumin corrected anion gap, the whole blood base excess, the plasma base excess, the standard base excess, then the whole blood base excess gap according to the Story's modification, then plasma base excess gap and standard base excess gap. And along with that, they also measure the strong ion gap. And apart from that, they have used two new approaches, which are known as unmeasured ion excess. It's a very new approach. And the another approach is unidentified anion, the interstitium plasma and erythrocyte model. These two needs computer simulations to do it. And what they saw that the predictive accuracy of strong ion gap according to Peter-Stewart approach and corrected anion gap according to the traditional approach to detect these unmeasured ions were more or less similar. So there was basically no difference between those two methods for detection of these unmeasured ions, whereas the newer models, that is the UIX and IPUEA, they did far better than these traditional and modern methods. So from these studies, it can be seen that probably Peter-Stewart and traditional approach, they do not give much of a difference. From the same study, which included more than 900 patients, what they observed that Peter-Stewart approach was, able only to identify 1% more patients who had metabolic acidosis, which were not detected by use of the traditional method. On the other hand, this approach failed to detect any acid-base abnormality in 3% of patients who was detected by the traditional method. So this, article, which was published in 2007, actually have shaken our belief in Peter-Stewart approach, and probably that is one of the reasons why many people are reluctant to use Peter-Stewart method. Now, apart from identifying, we all know that acid-base status of a patient can predict the mortality, and many studies have been done. I have given an example of only 2 studies. If we look into the ROC of these parameters, whether it's a strong ion gap or an ion gap corrected, their predictive ability were more or less similar, and the predictive ability was actually bad. It was in the range of around 0.6. The area under the curve of the ROC was around 0.6, which was not a very good predictive ability. So none of this, whether you use traditional method or you use Peter-Stewart method, were not reliable for prediction of mortality. And it's a very recent review article, which was, I think, published in 2018, and they have collected relevant literature up to 2016, if I'm not mistaken. They have said in their conclusion that despite the proposed equivalence between traditional approach and the Stewart approach, our literature shows inconsistent results on the comparison between 2 approaches for diagnostic and prognostic performance. So again, there is a question whether should we use, so people can say that should we use Peter-Stewart approach? So let us forget about the bigger picture, what these studies are saying. Let us consider and let us take a closer look into individual patients whose example was given in a very recent paper in Journal of Clinical Monitoring and Computing in 2021. It's a very interesting paper. If you look into patient 1, and both of these patients have got a normal CO2, which is not mentioned here because I have taken a snapshot from the article, so it is not visible here. In the patient 1, the pH is 7.37, okay pH, lactate is 24.2, okay lactate, and the standard base excess is -0.2, okay. And in patient 2, the pH is 7.21, yes, he has got acidemia, and standard base excess is -3.7. So many times it does not match, at least to me, because for a base excess of -3.7, I was expecting the pH to be a little bit higher. Or for a pH of 7.21, I was expecting the standard base excess to be a little bit more lower, more negative. But at least this does not say us much. But what I can assume that patient 1 probably does not have any acid-base disorder, and patient 2 has got acidemia, but it is not very severe. Now, if you look into the same patient, the same data, and if you look into the last line, that is the corrected anion gap. For the patient 1, we see that the corrected anion gap is 12.1, which is okay. So even by this approach, we think that probably this patient does not have any acid-base imbalance, at least by the traditional method. And in patient 2, we see that corrected anion gap is 22. It's quite surprising to have a corrected anion gap of 22 for a base excess of -3. So if we would not have looked into corrected anion gap, probably we would not have understood that the acidosis of the patient is severe, even though base excess is only -3.7. But this corrected anion gap does not tell me what is actually happening or what is causing this high anion gap. Now, if we look into the full set of data in this particular patient, these two particular patients, and we analyze them according to the Story's modification, which like I have shown you a few minutes ago. Then we see that in the first patient, the acidifying effect of chlorine is -7. So for a base excess of 0.2, -0.2, the acidifying effect of chlorine is -7. So we have somehow missed the acidifying effect of hyperchloremia in this particular patient. And in the patient number 2, the acidifying effect of other unmeasured ions, which is the last column, we say it is -11.5. So this could have been missed only if we have concentrated the base excess of -3.7. Now, why this base, excess ion of -11.5 milliequivalent has not led to a very low standard base excess? It is simply because the patient has got a low albumin and some other electrolyte disturbances. So if we would not have considered Peters-Swart approach, we would not have understood what is actually going on in these patients. At least for me, one of the very reassuring data that has come up recently in 2020, where they have looked into the acid-base imbalance of patients in a cohort of patients who has suffered from shock, mainly septic shock. What they have observed, it's very, very interesting. They have observed that among 42 patients without metabolic acidosis, according to a traditional assessment, that means standard base excess of more than -2, or in a high corrected NN gap, 17 patients of those 42 had a normal corrected NN gap. And among those 17, 13 had some acidifying or alkalizing disturbance that could be detected if we would have been using SWAT approach. And what they saw, that among the 149 patients included in the study, the assessment based on the standard base excess and the corrected NN gap failed to identify metabolic acidosis that was identified by the modified Story assessment in 8.7% of patients. This is not a very less percentage. Now, whether the treatment of those acidifying or alkalizing issues that is going on in those patients where it was identified the Peters-Swart method, whether that leads to an improved outcome or not, that's a debate for another day. This one interesting figure from a study which was published only this year. This was done among 400 patients who were admitted into HDU after operative procedure. If you look into the middle column, these are the patients who had a base excess of within -3 to +3. That means they seemingly had a normal pH and acid-base status. Sizable of them had a strong ion difference of less than 37. That means some acidifying effect from ions was going on. And a few had a strong ion difference of more than 43. That means some alkalizing effect was going on. So if you would not have used Peters-Swart approach, probably we would have missed this acidifying and alkalizing effect in this group of patients who probably look seemingly fit if we use the traditional approach. At the beginning, I said that we will evaluate these two approaches on the basis of which approach is clinically attractive. Now we see that Peters-Swart approach is also clinically attractive. Which approach effectively separates the sick from the healthy? There are sizable of patients which would have regarded as healthy if we consider traditional approach, but they were shown to have some acid-base imbalance for sick from that point of view by Peters-Swart approach. Yes, we have seen that it narrows down the diagnostic possibilities, and we have seen example that actually it grades the degree of sickness, which probably we would have missed if we would have been using the traditional approach. Now, my last 3 or 4 slides. Whenever we talk about patients in critical care or post-operative patients, there have got many things that is happening inside their body. There are many things which are measured, which are not measured, which we know, which we do not know. But let us see how does Peters-Swart fare in a patient where only one physical perturbation is going on. It's a very interesting study which was published, I think, this month in Journal of Critical Care. What they did in volunteers, healthy volunteers, they have given them a periods of inhalation and exhalation so that they have to hyperventilate so that the partial pressure of carbon dioxide goes down. And then they did measure the ABG at various points of time during that period of 30 minutes of study. If you look into the graph on the left side, that is according to the traditional approach, what they saw that all all the healthy individuals were at the position 1, that is red dot 1, that is they were in the normal. And after hyperventilation, they went to point 2, that is within the compensatory mechanism of acute respiratory alkalosis. And then at the end of the study, they have come back to point 3. That means they are reverting back more or less towards the normal. So if you would have been using only this approach, we would have said, okay, everything is normal in this particular patient. But when they analyzed the ABG from SWOT approach, what they saw that there was statistically significant change in strong iron difference. There was statistically significant in strong iron difference effective and strong iron gap. So what it told us that there are significant acid-base status, changes of acid-base status that is happening with seemingly hyperventilation. And this is not, very uncommon to see, because probably what we are seeing here is the manifestation of Haldane effect or movements of ions between interstitium, plasma, and erythrocyte during physiological or pathological part of the. Now coming to the last part of my topic, Peter-Stewart approach and its effect on the choice of fluid, intravenous fluid. This was a very small letter to the editor that I published maybe around that I sent maybe around 8 years back to Indian Journal of Critical Care Medicine. They were gracious enough to accept it, where we have discussed that it is not the pH of the solution or the other things that we think that is going to influence the pH into the recipients. The change of pH or acid-base in the recipient after intravenous fluid can actually be explained in terms of the Peter-Stewart approach. That shows the, the consequence of various intravenous fluids. And if you concentrate that all intravenous fluid, they have got some strong cations and a strong ion. That means they have got a specific SID. And there are many intravenous fluids, they have got various, colloids. And these colloids can act as a weak non-volatile acid. So these fluids, they have at least 2 independent factors according to Peter-Stewart approach, that is the SID and ATOL, because we do not normally have a dissolved carbon dioxide in these solutions. And that is the reason why when we infuse these solutions into patients, they are bound to cause acid-base imbalance, and it can be predicted according to Peter-Stewart approach. Because of paucity of time, I will not be explaining to that. But there are very new RCTs that have compared the acid-base, influence of acid-base status in the recipients of intravenous fluid between unbalanced fluid like 0.10% sodium chlorine and balanced fluid versus some other fluid, and even colloid versus crystalloid. All of them have shown that actually the acid-base status of the patient, it changes according to the intravenous fluid that we use. I cannot. This same situation where I tried to understand the Peter-Stewart around 10 years back. These papers are now trying to concentrate. These papers are trying to concentrate, and they are trying to explain the behavior of acid-base status of extracellular fluid by looking at the movement of ions between the interstitium, the plasma, and the erythrocyte, but their framework depends on the work of Peter-Stewart. All these approaches that probably you will be seeing in next years or so are based on the approach which has been put forward by Peter-Stewart.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Priyam, for that presentation. Yes, in fact, I've been using the Bryan-Story modified approach to the Stewart equation for quite a while now, and I find it quite useful. The problem with base excesses is just a number, and you don't know where does it come from. You don't get to the bottom of where does the metabolic acidosis come from. And based on the 3-step equation that Bryan-Story put forward, it is reasonably simple by the bedside using mental maths alone to arrive at a conclusion as to where the acid comes from. For instance, the 3 steps that you mentioned correctly was, first is the strong ion difference, sodium minus chloride minus 35. So sodium minus chloride minus 35 will give you the base excess that is contributed to by the strong ion difference. And second is the albumin effect. Albumin, as you know, is a weak acid. So that will be 0.25 multiplied by actual, the 42 minus measured albumin, and 1 minus lactate will be the contribution to the base excess by the lactate. And whatever you find beyond that will be unmeasured ions. Unmeasured ions will include phosphate, sulfate. Phosphate particularly is important in renal failure. Hyperphosphatemia is a very important cause of metabolic acidosis in renal failure, which you will easily overlook unless you look for it using the Stewart approach. Similarly, ketoacidosis. In fact, we had a patient the other day who had unexplained acidosis, and by the Stewart approach, it suggested that he had unmeasured ions, and that obviously was the case. The problem was ketoacidosis. So it's a reasonably simplified approach by the bedside. And the other important thing I'd like to highlight is the wider the strong ion difference, or the difference between sodium and chloride, the more alkalotic the situation would be. And the narrower the strong ion difference, the more acidotic it is going to be. So just by the sodium to chloride difference, you can tell the strong ion difference and which way the acid-base balance tends to tilt. For instance, hyperchloremia, we all know, causes a metabolic acidosis. Why does it do so? Because it narrows down the strong ion difference. When the chloride rises, the sodium to chloride difference becomes narrow and you have metabolic acidosis. And the reverse occurs with hypochloremia. The strong ion difference widens and you get a metabolic alkalosis. Similarly, if the sodium rises, if the sodium level rises, the strong ion difference becomes narrow. Sodium minus chloride difference becomes narrow. And the sodium minus chloride difference becomes wide and you get a metabolic alkalosis with hypernatremia. Similarly, with hyponatremia, you get a wide strong ion difference, and that will give you a metabolic, hyponatremia will give you a narrow strong ion difference, and that'll give you a metabolic acidosis. So these are some of the very commonly encountered problems in bedside practice that we come across every day, where Stewart would come to be very useful. And as I mentioned, the Bryan-Story approach makes it very simple to be able to get at the basic problem that's going on behind the base excess number that you see. So thanks very much. We'll see if there are any questions. You can raise your questions in the chat box or maybe ask them. If there are no more questions, shall we go on to the next talk?
Yes, Dr. Chacko.
Okay.
Thank you.
So the next topic is an equally interesting topic that has captivated critical care physicians over the last more than a decade, I would say. The role of lactate, particularly in regard to sepsis. There has been a lot of contentious debate on this, whether you should resuscitate your septic patients based on the lactate levels. What levels do you follow? And should you chase down the lactate level during sepsis resuscitation? As we know today, sepsis particularly does not very often result in anaerobic metabolism and lactate production through anaerobic metabolism. There are many other different pathways of lactate excess in sepsis, including excessive adrenergic stimulation and excessive aerobic metabolism first. And then there is mitochondrial failure that may occur that may lead to production of lactate. Lung and liver may be the source of lactate in sepsis as well. So it is one thing that to say that high lactate levels carry high mortality, but it's a completely separate issue if you blame the lactate for the mortality. That is simply not true, because lactate is an alternate fuel as well, because the excess lactate that is produced in a stress situation is shuttled across to other organs like the brain and the heart, which use lactate as fuel for the generation of ATP by conversion to pyruvate acetyl-CoA through the citric acid cycle. So should we really blame lactate, and should we try to chase it down and normalize it, particularly in sepsis? Dr. Nupur Gupta, consultant in critical care at Artemis Hospital, will guide us through that. She is a prominent academician. Her areas of interest include acid-base balance, as well as ultrasound, and she would enlighten us on what should we think of lactate as things stand today. Over to you, Dr. Nupur.
Thank you for the introduction, sir. Good evening, everyone. I'll just share my slides here. Are my slides visible?
Not yet.
Just a minute, sir. I'll do that. Sorry for the delay.
Yes, that's all now.
Good evening, everyone. And I'm grateful to Dr. Reshma and Dr. Saurabh for giving me this opportunity to talk amongst such esteemed company. So my topic for today is lactate the fall guy in acid-base disorders? So way back when I had first joined critical care and I was introduced to the concept of lactates, then there was one notion which stood out, or rather summarized lactates for me and practically for most of us, that lactates are bad and lactates are evil. And whenever we find a patient with raised lactates, then we should be doing something in order to remove them, maybe administer IV fluids or guide our fluid therapy primarily to it. And over the next few years, we have just seen how lactate-guided management has grown more and more in prominence. But when Dr. Saurabh gave me this topic and I started reading about it, it was an eye-opener for me as well. And many of my old beliefs were refuted. And I would like to share these views here with you. And at the same time, I'll probably try to convince you that lactates are not so bad. So we have many myths about lactate, as Sir said. That one is that lactates cause acidosis. This is the most common myth that we have. Second is that increased lactates in sepsis is due to anaerobic metabolism and low oxygen delivery. This is also has proven to be a myth. And third, that elevated lactates needs IV fluids, which most of us so commonly do. So we'll be discussing one by one about these myths. But prior to that, just a very brief review about the history of lactates and how lactates have come to such a vaulted position they hold today in sepsis. So lactates were first discovered in sour milk in 1780 by a Swedish chemist, Carl William Scheele. Following approximately 50 years later, John and Joseph Sherrill, who was a physician and an avid chemist, he was investigating a seasonal epidemic of puerperal fever, and he found that many young women who had succumbed to sepsis had high levels of lactate in the blood. And so lactates came to be known as bad. A decade later, Fletcher and Hopkins, they stimulated amphibian muscle fibers under variable conditions of oxygen, and they found that lactates accumulated most rapidly under anaerobic conditions. This was also reinforced by Otto Meyerhoff, who was a Nobel Prize winner as well, and he observed the same, that lactates accumulated in the absence of oxygen, and they were removed upon the return of oxygen. And so lactates became to be known as a product of hypoxia. This was followed by many clinical studies, with some of the prominent one being that Wheel and Roeder in 1964, they did a clinical study and found lactates to act as a metabolic index of severity of shock. That is, more the lactate levels were, it corresponded to the severity of circulatory failure. They even claimed that if the patient had more than 4 millimoles per liter of lactates, then it proved a fatal outcome. Gradually in 1983, Vincent and colleagues, they introduced the concept of serial lactate measurements as we now do. And they even measured lactate as early as 20 minutes. And they found that the survivors had a more than 10% reduction in the lactates as compared to the non-survivors. And so with these studies and many more, lactates made their way into the surviving sepsis guidelines. So the first time lactates were mentioned in the 1992 surviving sepsis guidelines when they were stated to be markers of end organ hypoperfusion. Gradually, they were even included in the definition. Gradually, they were even included in the definitions of sepsis-induced tissue hypoperfusion when they were defined. When sepsis-induced hypoperfusion was defined as hypotension persisting even after initial fluid challenges or blood lactate concentration more than 4. They also, surviving sepsis then suggested guiding our fluid resuscitation to lactates. That is, they suggested targeting resuscitation to normalize lactate in patients with elevated lactate levels as a marker of tissue hypoperfusion. However, the important point that we should keep here in mind is that this was a grade 2C recommendation. And with weak recommendation and with a low quality of evidence. Now in 2016, when Surviving Sepsis published their new guidelines, they went back on their own words, which they had earlier said that lactate is a marker of tissue hypoperfusion. And here they said that serum lactate is not a direct measure of tissue perfusion. And increases in serum lactate may well represent tissue hypoxia, accelerated aerobic glycolysis, driven by beta-adrenergic stimulation, or even other causes such as liver failure. At the same time, however, they did not change their suggestion for lactate-guided resuscitation. So obviously this statement, which was a backtracking on the earlier statement, did leave many of us with some food for thought, and also the need to revisit lactates, more so in the wake of a lot of evidence which is coming up in the last 5 years or so, which is showing that lactate-guided fluid management is actually harmful. So let us discuss our first myth, the most common one, that lactate is equal to acid, that lactates, elevated lactates cause acidosis. More commonly, whenever we refer to lactates and metabolic acidosis in a patient, we normally refer to it as lactic acidosis, which actually is a misnomer. We'll be discussing it here. So if we have to go back to the biochemistry to understand this, so let us quickly go through the aerobic and the anaerobic metabolisms. So the first step of glycolysis actually occurs when glucose is converted to the pyruvate molecules in cytoplasm. And this results in the conversion of 2 ADP molecules with the resultant production of 2 ATP. And at the same time, 2 NAD plus molecules are converted to 2 NADH molecules. This pyruvate then goes into the mitochondria for the oxidative phosphorylation. So first, this pyruvate molecules, they're converted to acetyl coenzyme A with the help of the enzyme pyruvate dehydrogenase. And this then acetyl coenzyme A finally goes into the PCA cycle and the oxidative phosphorylation with the resultant production of 38 ATP. So the important point that we should, however, keep here in mind is that this step, the conversion of pyruvate to acetyl coenzyme A, is actually a rate limiting step of glycolysis. In certain conditions, pyruvate, instead of going for oxidative phosphorylation, goes into the so-called anaerobic cycle and it gets converted to 2 molecules of lactate with the production of ATP. And during this process, NADH is converted to NAD. So there are certain conditions under which pyruvate goes for this cycle, some of which are, and the most common ones obviously, one is lack of oxygen. Obviously we know, because then pyruvate is unable to shuttle itself into the oxidative phosphorylation. The second is when there is malfunctioning of the pyruvate dehydrogenase enzyme, obviously because pyruvate dehydrogenase is required for the conversion of pyruvate to acetyl-CoA, as I told you. And this is the substrate for oxidative phosphorylation. And the third is when there is excess of pyruvate molecules. This excess of pyruvate molecules actually overwhelms the capacity of the oxidative phosphorylation, especially with pyruvate dehydrogenase enzyme being the rate limiting step. Right. So when we look at these equations a little more closely, we'll see that when pyruvate is converted to lactate, when two pyruvate molecules, they combine with two NADH molecules and two hydrogen ions with the resultant production of two lactates and two NAD molecules. So now here we see that actually protons are being consumed for the production of lactates. When pyruvate is converted to lactate, then there are no protons which are formed. Rather, two protons are being utilized by pyruvate to form two molecules of lactate. So maybe it's lactate alkalosis, but surely it's not lactic acidosis, as we all know. This was also yes. So, right. So where do these protons arise from? Obviously, the question arises. Well, the answer to it is that the hydrolysis of ATP. I'll give it in a more little detail that when glucose, it utilizes two ATP molecules, it gets converted to two ATP molecules and two water ions and ultimately two lactates. This ATP reactivates itself. It is hydrolyzed. It is hydrolyzed back to ADP because this ADP is required for further glycolysis to happen. This process releases two hydrogen ions. Source of the protons in a misnomer which is known as lactic acidosis. Another source of protons is when oxidative phosphorylation actually counterbalances the cytoplasmic proton generating processes of ATP hydrolysis. It is better depicted here in diagram that when glucose is getting converted to pyruvate and then subsequently to lactates, it is releasing this ATP. This ATP is hydrolyzing back to ADP and two hydrogen ions are released. These hydrogen ions are actually buffered when they enter and are utilized in the oxidative phosphorylation in the mitochondria. So oxidative phosphorylation also buffers the cytoplasmic protons. And normally all these processes, that is consumption of protons and the production of protons, they normally remain in a steady state in the body. However, in certain conditions when the body is under stress, for example, sepsis, or maybe we have toxins which are inhibiting oxidative phosphorylation, in all these conditions, this balance is tipped off, resulting in lactate production. So here is just depicting when oxidative phosphorylation is impaired, then glucose is going for the anaerobic cycle and producing lactates, but at the same time, it is the hydrogen ions which were produced by ATP hydrolysis are not able to go into the mitochondria, as a result of which these hydrogen ions accumulate in the cytoplasm, resulting in metabolic acidosis. So we see from all this knowledge that lactic acidosis is actually a misnomer, and probably there is no such entity which as lactic acidosis in our bodies. It's just an association by which we have made causation that increased lactates cause acidosis. So here is an example, here is an ABG in which we can see that the pH of the patient is normal, but the patient here has raised lactates, but at the same time, the pH remained normal. So lactates are not actually causing acidosis. They are independent. Acidosis is independent of hyperlactatemia. Now coming to our second myth, that hyperlactatemia in sepsis is due to anaerobic metabolism. Well, traditionally it was believed that elevated lactates during sepsis is due to anaerobic metabolism and as a consequence of inadequate perfusion with low oxygen delivery to the tissues. More so, it also acted as an endpoint in sepsis resuscitation and also indicators of resolution of global tissue hypoxia. However, we have ample of evidence which is telling us that during sepsis and in patients with elevated lactates, all of these patients, they have hyperdynamic circulation with normal PO2s at the tissue levels or even high PO2s at the tissue levels. I'll enlist some of the studies here. So here we have many studies. One study was done by Buchstegers et al., and they studied the muscle PO2 levels in septic patients, and they found that there was no evidence of muscle hypoxia. Rather, in some patients, the PO2 levels were found to be higher at the muscle level. Another study by Vandermeer et al., they also found bladder mucosal PO2s. Rigara et al. Found no correlation between hypoxia-induced factor 1 and lactate levels. Sorry. Also, they say that it has been found that lactate production, lung acts as a primary source of lactate production during sepsis. Lung, which is actually bathed in oxygen. So if that is producing lactates, it is a predominant producer of lactates during sepsis, actually causing rise in lactates, seems faulty. Another study was done by Mira et al. When they found no correlation between the delivery of oxygen and the venous O2 levels and the lactate levels. Ronco et al. Also did the same, and they found in 1993, they did the study and they found that sepsis did not alter the critical oxygen delivery for anaerobic metabolism or tissue oxygen extraction ability in any interventions which are aiming to increase the oxygen delivery to supranormal levels. Critically ill humans may be inappropriate. This is one of the studies, though from all these evidences, we can make out that anaerobic metabolism does not happen to much extent, and especially in the initial stages during sepsis, and thereby they resulting in increase of lactates during sepsis doesn't look fine. So obviously now we have seen that sepsis is associated with hyperlactatemia, and then the question arose that if hypoperfusion induced lactatemia, then what is? As Sir told just now, that the answer is accelerated aerobic glycolysis has been found to increase lactates. So sepsis causes inflammation. This increases the metabolic demand of the body. This causes increased catecholamines release, which increases aerobic glycolysis. And this increased aerobic glycolysis results in increased pyruvate production. Again, pyruvate production is produced in so much of excess that it exceeds the oxidative capacity of oxidative phosphorylation of the mitochondria. In order to produce some energy for our body, gets converted to lactates, and with the production of 2 ATP at least. This is another diagram which is showing the same and a better, with a closer look, that epinephrine, maybe if it's endogenous or even exogenous, via beta-2 receptor, it stimulates the cyclic AMP, thereby stimulating the sodium ATPase pump. This sodium ATPase pump, it converts ADP, it utilizes ATP to form ADP, and this ADP, it reactivates glycolysis, resulting in more pyruvate formation, which is obviously unable to go to oxidative phosphorylation, as a result, conforms lactate. And this part as well, when many investigators use drugs which inhibit the catecholamine release, and they found the lactate levels to fall. So here there was a study which was done in 2013 by Morelli et al. And they studied esmolol in patients of septic shock. And they found that the patients in the esmolol group, they had low lactate levels as compared to the ones in the normal group. The oxygen delivery was also low in the esmolol group. And again, reiterating the fact that low oxygen delivery is not the cause for increased lactates. So they found that esmolol caused low oxygen delivery, and at the same time, it also reduced the lactate levels. Another study was done in dexmedetomidine by using dexmedetomidine, and they found that dexmedetomidine, by inhibiting catecholamines during stress, also resulted in low lactate levels in patients who were sedated using dexmedetomidine versus those who weren't. Another mechanism by which lactates are accumulated during sepsis has been postulated as the malfunctioning of pyruvate dehydrogenase enzyme. This enzyme, as I just told earlier, is an essential enzyme which converts pyruvate to acetyl coenzyme A, which acts as a substrate for oxidative phosphorylation. And the function of this enzyme has been reported to be impaired in sepsis, primarily due to cytokine-mediated inflammation. This was a study done by Erin Nuzzo, and they found that pyruvate dehydrogenase activity was decreased in peripheral blood mononuclear cells of patients with sepsis. This also forms the basis of why thiamine was postulated as a metabolic resuscitator in septic patients, because thiamine acts as a cofactor for pyruvate dehydrogenase enzyme. Though thiamine has not shown to have much of effect clinically, but still this was the postulated mechanism. So now obviously the question arises that from all these evidences, we know that, that lactates are not a direct measure of tissue hypoperfusion, and there may be many other reasons. So now the obvious question arises that if lactates are not a direct measure of perfusion, then why do we really need to administer IV fluids in order to correct them? So here comes the third myth, that elevated lactates require IV fluid. So there is something known as lacto-bolo-reflex, a very interesting term coined by Dr. Spiegel and Dr. Paul Merrick. They said that lacto-bolo-reflex is a well-known pathological reflex observed in the majority of house staff and a large portion of attending physicians, and it involves the reflexive administration of IV fluids just in response to serum lactate, which is above normal. And it is so true because most of us do that, and even now, till date, we all are following this. But the important thing here is that if we look back at the evidence for which shows the benefits of lactate-guided resuscitation, then we realize that we do not have much evidence to support it. There are very few RCTs, and most of the data that we have is actually observational. So, and also surviving sepsis, when it told us to guide our resuscitation to lactate, it was a very weak recommendation. So there are very few RCTs here. One of them was done by Janssen et al. In 2010, and they randomized 348 patients, ICU patients, only 40% of whom who had severe sepsis or septic shock with lactates of more than 3. And he randomized them to either receive resuscitation guided by lactates, that is a 20% lactate reduction every 2 hours, or the usual care group in which the lactate levels were not known. And he found that the lactate group had higher IV fluid administered to them. Also, the amount of vasodilators that were used were more in the lactate group. And in addition to this, importantly, there was no improvement in hospital mortality in the lactate group. In the post hoc analysis, however, he did find that lactate guidance had improved mortality, but then it was a post hoc analysis, which obviously held less importance as compared to the blind randomized. They did the ShockNet trial, and they compared the lactate guided approach versus SCVO2 guided resuscitation. And they found both the resuscitative strategies to be similar. But then, as we all know, that SCVO2 is now no more used, and it has not shown to be of any, SCVO2 guided resuscitation has not shown to be of any benefit. So this itself puts a doubt in it. So in the new evidences that we have, one, and the very prominent one, is the Andromeda shock trial. This trial was done by Hernandez et al. And it was a well-conducted multi-center RCT, which randomized 424 patients around 28 ICUs from the period of 2017 to 2018. It included patients with septic shock who had lactate levels more than 2 millimoles per liter. And he randomized capillary refilling time resuscitation. And he found that the 28-day mortality was 34.9% in the peripheral perfusion group versus 43.4% in the lactate group. Also, the organ dysfunction was less in the peripheral perfusion group as compared to the lactate group. His results also stated that the amount of fluid that was administered to the lactate group was significantly more as compared to the peripheral perfusion group. So though the difference in mortality here is not significant, statistically significant, but this 9% increase in mortality in the lactate group cannot be ignored, and surely it needs more future trials for a better understanding. Surviving Sepsis 2021 also made a new revision when they included and they suggested that we suggest using capillary refilling time to guide resuscitation as an adjunct to other measures of perfusion. Evidences which have come up, which have shown us the harm of administering excess IV fluids, I think we should definitely relook at our strategy of administering IV fluids in response to lactates, because maybe it's just causing more harm than benefits. So now, after all these things, the question arises then, why the lactates? Why does the body even produce lactates during sepsis or during stress? As a fuel for oxidation and glucose regeneration, and therefore they act as an essential source of energy. It is used for gluconeogenesis in hepatocytes and restores glucose and glycogen by the Cori cycle. It is also a part of oxidative phosphorylation in the liver, kidney, and as I said, that it is used as a fuel by the myocardium and by the brain during stress. It becomes a very important fuel during stress. And lactate removal has itself been shown to be associated with cardiovascular collapse during stress. So this is a quick cycle here. I'll show that lactates, when they are released in the blood, they go for oxidative phosphorylation in the muscles, being used here as a fuel, in the heart, in the brain, where everywhere it is used as a fuel during stress. They also go to the liver, get converted to glucose by the Cori cycle, and then this glucose is again subsequently used as a fuel. They also get stored as glycogen. Another important thing is that lactates, they have shown to go into astrocyte neuron shuttling, in which lactate actually goes into the astrocytes in the neurons, where it is used as a fuel and also for the manufacturing of various neurotransmitters and amino acids. And here we have many studies. We have many studies which have shown this, that lactates are beneficial. Some of them are, I'll just enlist a few of them. Myocardial lactate deprivation here is associated with decreased cardiovascular performance and decreased myocardial energetic and early death in endotoxic shock. Now even people have started administrating exogenous lactates, because exogenous lactates has shown to improve neurocognitive functions in some patients with mild TBI. Also, lactates have shown to improve fluid balance and hemodynamics in porcine endotoxic shock. Obviously, all these things need more research, but maybe in the coming years, instead of during stress. So to conclude, raised lactates do not cause acidosis, which actually occurs due to ATP hydrolysis. Sepsis-associated hyperlactatemia is due to catecholamine-induced accelerated aerobic glycolysis and not due to oxygen debt. Hyperlactatemia often doesn't indicate hypoperfusion or tissue hypoxia, as we have been thinking all these decades. Raised lactates, most importantly, that raised lactates should not trigger the physician to thoughtlessly administer IV fluids. And lactate is a survival advantage, which grows more intensity as the disease severity increases. At the same time, hyperlactatemia is a prognostic marker. It is a marker of illness severity, and it is a strong indicator of mortality. So we do need to measure lactates, but once we measure lactates, then it should draw our attention to probably the amount and the amount of the underlying stress response that the body has. And we should not reflexively administer IV fluids for it. Physicians should understand the complexity of lactate production, metabolism, and not use it as a standalone biomarker. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Nupur, for that. Indeed, we tend to use lactate rather irrationally to guide resuscitation, particularly in septic patients, which can truly be harmful. We all know, as you rightly pointed out, that lactate means severe illness. And high lactase, of course, is associated with increased mortality. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you should do all sorts of things to try to chase it down and bring it back to normal, which is the gist of what surviving sepsis guidelines suggest. And that is truly not based on evidence. They themselves say that it's not based on evidence, it's just based on expert opinion and our reason and logic behind the use of fluid, for instance. Make sure that you don't drown your patient in intravenous fluid, which has been shown to be very harmful in terms of long-term outcomes in the critically ill patients in several studies. You mentioned the Andromeda shock trial. Yes, it showed numerically there was a survival advantage in terms of 28-day mortality in patients who are guided by capillary refill time of 3 seconds compared to lactate-guided resuscitation. In fact, they came up recently with a post-hoc analysis of the Andromeda shock trial in which they looked specifically at patients who achieved the goal of normalization of capillary refill, and then they looked at their further course depending on to which arm they were randomized, whether they were randomized to the lactate arm or they were randomized to the capillary refill arm. So those patients in whom the capillary refill had normalized and who were randomized to the lactate arm, they obviously underwent more and more resuscitative interventions, even after normalization of capillary refill time. And they found that the mortality was significantly higher among patients who had normal capillary refill, but kept on receiving interventions to normalize lactate. So that is the bottom line. I think a very important message in that post, although it says post hoc, it just conveys the fact that you shouldn't go solely by lactate levels, and that might often lead to poor outcomes if you do so, particularly in terms of the lactobolus reflex you mentioned and drowning, ending up drowning your patient in intravenous fluid. So, so much for lactate. If there are any questions, I can't see any questions specific to lactate on the chat box. If anybody has any questions, I suppose they can ask now. If there are no questions, we can go on to the next. The acid-base balance in patients with kidney disease by Dr. Sharmila Sinha, who is a senior consultant in critical care medicine at Apollo Hospital, Bhubaneswar. Her main focus of interest are neurocritical care, polytrauma, ventilation, renal replacement therapy, infection control, nutrition. She is also the very well-known associate editor of Critical Care Communications. So over to you, Dr. Sharmila.
Thank you, sir, for the nice words of introductions. And it has been a very excellent evening today, listening to previous speakers on the aspects of acid-base balances. So I'll be speaking on the management of acid-base disorders in a patient with renal dysfunctions. It is indeed a vast topic, and I would try to keep it concise, especially focused to the basic physiology part and then right on to the clinical management. I'll share my screen. So, yeah. Yeah, I hope my screen is visible. So the learning objective of the session would be to understand the role of kidney in acid-base homeostasis. It will be a kind of recapitulation of already what we know, how the kidney takes part in acid-base homeostasis in our body, and the acid-base issues that arise in case a patient has got renal dysfunctions. the complications of it, and how do you go about its treatment. So acid-base disorders in a patient who might have some renal dysfunctions, when we see these patients or encounter these patients in intensive care units, can be broadly divided into 3 categories. Most of these patients, when they come to ICUs, might have some element or some degree of chronic kidney disease, or they might be having acute on chronic kidney disease, or acute kidney disease, or acute kidney injury, as we call it more popularly these days. So these are the 3 broad categories of patients which we see in the intensive care units, which might be having renal dysfunctions, and hence they have got some extent of acid-base disorders in them. So of this, broadly in our experience, we commonly see the metabolic acidosis, which is the commonest kind of disorder or in this group of patients. And this is closely followed by a combined scenarios, like they might be having combined metabolic and respiratory acidosis per se. Metabolic alkalosis in a patient who has got renal dysfunction is very rarely seen, and there are very exceptional situations, but we'll not go into details of those cases. Mostly we'll confine our discussions to patients who have got metabolic acidosis, and they might be having combined situations like metabolic and respiratory acidosis. So let's quick look at this role of kidney in acid-base homeostasis. So just recapitulating the basic physiology, that in a normal body, human body, non-volatile acids are produced at a rate of around up to 1 milliequivalents per kg per day. And our kidneys does an excellent function in matching this acid production to excretion of these bodies out of our body. So how, once these acids are produced inside our body, they do get buffered at various levels. As soon as these acids pour into our serum or bloodstream, there is a great deal of various cadres of buffer situated in the serum. Mostly they're divided into either intracellular compartment or extracellular phosphates at the predominant buffers, and at the extracellular level they are mainly bicarbonate, and also to some lesser degree they're handled by albumin, carbonate, which are also situated in the bones. Now once this bicarbonate is filtered through the glomerulus, it is absorbed in the proximal tubules, and the net acid excretion is actually overall decided by a process called ammoniogenesis, whereby the glutamine which is inside the cells, epithelial cells, they're broken down into 2 ammonium ions and 1 alpha ketoglutarate ions. I would emphasize on this process of ammoniogenesis because this is the predominant mechanism which is responsible for acid excretion in our body, where glutamine is broken down into 2 ammonium ions and 1 alpha ketoglutarate. Now this ammonia, what happens to it? It diffuses into the proximal tubules and gets excreted or exchanged with the ammonia hydrogen exchange receptor, which is located in the epithelial cells. And this alpha ketoglutarate breaks down into 2 bicarbonate ions, which is excreted. And also at the level of the distal tubules and proximal tubules, there is generations and excretion of hydrogen ions. Though we commonly find metabolic acidosis in patients who have got renal dysfunctions of various degrees, there are a distinct group of patients who might be having kidney dysfunctions. Mostly those are stable chronic kidney disease patients who might be having a eubicarbonemic situations. They might be having some degree of metabolic acidosis, which is subtle, but if you look at the bicarbonate levels in the blood, they are usually in the normal ranges. And how do they make up for it? This is due to the production of more of urinary and plasma endothelial-1 and aldosterone levels. We'll come to their roles in the subsequent slides. And they also have got increased paracrine hormones, which are produced in the kidneys, like this endothelin-1 or the angiotensin-2 and aldosterone, which influences the net acid secretion from the renal tubules. There is also a phenomenon of upregulation of these H+ ion transporters in proximal tubules, and this ammonium and hydrogen ion exchangers, and these enzymes in distal tubules, ascending loop of Henle, and proton potassium exchange. Now this is a good table actually, which is derived, it's a recent article. It was published in 2018 in the Journal of American Society of Nephrology. This flowchart actually tells us once there is a problem in the renal tubules, there is a renal dysfunctions, what are the adaptive responses that manifest in our body through this renal glomerulus or the renal tubules. So once there is an increased acid production is there, or if there is increase in acid retention in the body, it leads to decreased interstitial and intracellular pH. So there is acidosis at the level of the interstitium and inside the cells. And this in return, it stimulates increased production of ammoniogenesis, that the phenomenon that I talked in the first slide, followed by endothelin 1 and the renin-angiotensin production gets enhanced. So this is the positive response or the adaptive response. This enhances other adaptive mechanisms come into play. And as a result, there is increased acid excretions per nephron and there is decreased acid retention. So body adjusts or accommodates this increased acid retentions. But if this phenomenon lasts longer, this adaptive response becomes a maladaptive response and it becomes in turn harmful and it gives rise to a vicious cycle. What happens thereby? Once this ammoniogenesis process is enhanced, there is increased production of this endothelial 1 or increased production of aldosterone and renal angiotensin. It again leads to activation of the complements, which could prove harmful. Pro-fibrotic mediators are also generated. This work on this tubules and interstitial injury and causes interstitial injury and gives rise to fibrosis in the gradual process. It leads to further loss of functioning nephrons and there is a progression of the chronic kidney disease. So this site is actually, it cites the progression of the CKD, that is the chronic kidney disease from stage 1. So when acidosis remains unaddressed for longer period of time, this adaptive process gets converted to a maladaptive response. And this is a phenomenon where I said that when there is increased production of this endothelial 1 or this renin-angiotensin 2 in the long run, it actually leads to this issues like proteinuria, tubular atrophy, inflammation, and fibrosis. And finally, the stage of the chronic kidney disease progresses. Similar responses for endothelial 1 as well. Now let's come to clinical case scenarios. These are two actual cases currently being treated in our intensive care units. So first one is a 72-year-old male who is a known case of coronary artery disease, who has got 2 stents in situ. He is a known hypertensive and diabetes under control. He has got chronic kidney disease. And on that night, he presented with progressive shortness of breath, with progressive decrease in urinations and decreased sensorium. There was no history of fever. And his COVID test was negative. Blood pressure was good. There was slight tachycardia up to the tune of 108 per minute. And he has been on antiplatelets. He was put on NIV because he was tachypneic and was in respiratory failure. The investigations when brought forth showed a TLC of around 12,400. So the working diagnosis was sepsis with acute and on chronic kidney disease. So now let's see his blood gases. So this is the blood gas on admissions in the emergency department. So this gentleman who is old has got a lot of comorbidities and has got decreased urinations, breathless and altered sensorium, has a pH of 7.31. So there is mild metabolic acidosis is already set in. Bicarbonate is 18.8. There is hyperkalemia 5.7, though he didn't have bradycardia, it was rather high on the higher side. And you can see as lactate is 1.28 and creatinine, it also shows on this ABG around 4.8. Now this patient was conservatively managed and he was on non-invasive ventilation for some time. Around 4 to 6 hours later, when the ABG was repeated, the pH has actually worsened from 7.31 to it has gone down to 7.29. And bicarbonate has also reduced and the base deficit has increased to actually minus 11.4. So there is a worsening of metabolic acidosis. Potassium remains almost more or less the same and lactate also remains the same. And this investigation came back as creatinine of 4.64. So there is severe metabolic acidosis. Another case similar in the same unit, she is a 62-year-old lady with carcinoma of colon with colostomy closure for which was done initially. Colostomy was done for the volvulus and later on it was closed. But she developed sepsis unfortunately with acute kidney injury. But the urine output was preserved. Creatinine was around 3.2. Unfortunately, she also sustained an anterior wall myocardial infarctions, which was new onset and currently now on ventilator for respiratory failure, is in shock and on reducing dose of vasopressors. So the working diagnosis for her is carcinoma colon with sepsis with anterior myocardial infarctions with acute kidney injury, but she's the non-oligotube type. So this is a case of actually acute kidney injury, and let's see her blood gases. See, this patient is actually much sicker than the first patient which we talked about. She has got acute kidney injury. She's in septic shock, and there is a cardiac dysfunction with a new MI on board. But her lactatas are normal, and the pH is normal. Bicarbonate is normal. There is no base deficit, though she definitely has got acute kidney injury. So this is a case of sepsis with septic shock with non-oliguric AKI. So the point we're trying to make here is like the patient who might be having renal dysfunctions, we have to know the etiology. So either it is a progressive chronic kidney disease progressing to end-stage renal disease, or it is an acute on chronic kidney disease as the first case we discussed. And this is a case which is a purely acute kidney injury. So despite having a grossly deranged renal dysfunction, she does not have acid-base disorder. So kidney dysfunction does not necessarily equate to any kind of metabolic acidosis. They can be having, renal dysfunctions, but body has got reserve to compensate for those renal dysfunctions. And it has been seen that up to 40% loss of nephrons or GFR is preserved. This kidney functions can be handled, or the acid-base functions can be handled. So why we are so worried about this metabolic acidosis, or why you're talking about acid-base disorders in a patient with renal dysfunctions? Because these are aplenty. First of all, in a patient who has got even say mild degree of chronic kidney disease, it can start damaging the body in a subtle way, in a cryptic way. And if it is ignored on a long term, it can cause devastating damage to the body because it induces protein catabolism. And some entity called MIA, I would emphasize on that because in our unit, we see around 45% of patients have who get admitted have got some degree of chronic disease element in our unit. And most of them have issues with their nutrition. And when we analyze, we find that for some reason or other, the diet always have been substandard or suboptimal. So this is a syndrome called MIA, malnutrition, inflammation, and atherosclerosis syndrome, which is usually found in patients who have got some, baseline disease of chronic kidney disease, and this keeps on progressing to a severe stage. And this inflammation actually gives rise to increased production of tumor necrosis factor alpha. Also, it has been shown to inhibit production of growth hormone, and as well as it opposes the action of growth hormone also at the peripheral tissue. And this is more imminent in cases of children actually, where disease at an early age, they these issues when the growth hormone is antagonized at the peripheral tissues level. Also interferes with the action of insulin-like growth factors 1, reduces calcium receptor sensitivity, the bones grow weak, there is stimulation of the parathyroid hormones, and this is a very vicious cascade which gets activated, like there is stimulation of the osteocytes. I would request the audiences to mute their mics, please. Yeah. So there is a stimulation of osteoclast, which promotes resorptions of the bone parenchyma. There is inhibition of the osteoblast. That means bone formation is reduced, and also the continuous mobilization of bone bases. So bone overall gets fractures. Can we request the audience to mute their mics, please? Please mute your mics. Thank you.
Maggi masala di thok gole na masala Maggi to dibo koisu. Buja nai kotha to agor double kele koila.
There is also phenomenon of increased insulin resistance. So in case a patient who has got kidney dysfunction has got diabetes, this patient also face a phenomenon of increased insulin resistance. There is an increase in the requirement of insulin or problem in sugar control in these patients. Also triglyceride levels, if they have high triglycerides, these also get interfered with. And more importantly, it is also seen that there is inhibition of the conversion of thyroxine to T3, that is triiodothyronine at the tissue levels. So it also opposes action of the thyroid hormones. And there is increased production of this hepcidin, which is one of the hormones or the inflammatory markers, which is responsible for causing anemia of chronic diseases. And for patients who are on hemodialysis, actually need more of erythropoietin. In cases of patients who are more acutely sick, as the case 2 that we discussed, in a patient who has got shock either due to septic sepsis or due to combined sepsis, like the second case who has got sepsis as well as cardiogenic cause, there is worsening of vasodilatations. They become refractory to the vasopressors and also precipitates the arrhythmias. It also lowers the threshold for seizures in patients who have got septic metabolic encephalopathy. There is increased requirement of vasopressors, as we discussed. There is increased more phenomenon of GI tolerance in these cases, and they tend to reject feed. It also increases the chance of critical illness, polyneuropathies, and overall recovery and mortality is high for longer time. So how do we treat this? Treatment modalities are two. Generally, either you put them for renal replacement therapies, they are severe enough, or you go for a conservative management. For patients who are usually in the mild to moderate range, usually conservative approach is adopted for them. And sodium bicarbonate actually has got a role in these cases. We'll come to its details in the next subsequent slides. And patients who have got stable kidney diseases and presenting to the intensive care units with some other illnesses, they are usually kept on renal diet, which is advised to be vegetable or fruit rich. Of course, one has to be careful for hyperkalemias. Food restrictions are usually advised, and less of acid generating food is included in these patients. Those patients who have got severe metabolic acidosis with more than 1 or 2 organ dysfunctions, they're usually advised for renal replacement therapies. And the absolute indications are usually severe metabolic acidosis, life-threatening hyperkalemia, especially who have got tall T waves or symptomatic bradycardias, patients who are in frank fluid overload, and or severe uremic symptoms like pericarditis or severe septic metabolic encephalopathy. So now let's have a quick look at this indications of sodium bicarbonate. For indicates, actually sodium bicarbonate has been controversial in the management of chronic kidney disease or acute on chronic kidney diseases or possibly in AKIs. But several studies have been conducted, especially in the last 1.5 decades, that have established a role of sodium bicarbonate in the management of stable kidney disease patients. Because it is seen that presence of metabolic acidosis in a patient who has got some element of chronic kidney disease, they usually worsen to end-stage renal disease faster compared to those group of patients who do not have metabolic acidosis. And use of alkaline therapy with oral supplementation actually has been established to slow the progression of chronic kidney disease. But one has to be cautious about not using excess alkyl therapy, because it may give rise to metabolic alkalosis, which again worsens the cardiac status and increases the chance of mortality. Of course, one has to have a note of cautions regarding hyperkalemia if one is going for a vegetable and fruit-rich diet. So this is actually a table that have been taken from Kidney Blood Pressure Research 2018, which recommends that bicarbonate concentrations from venous plasma or venous blood to be checked for all patients with chronic kidney disease. And for patients, those who have CKD stage 4 and 5, at least once a year, this bicarbonate level should be checked. And for patients where it is less than 22 millimoles per liter, they are the ones who should be receiving oral alkali therapy as appropriate. And these are mainly based on observational studies. And the goal of treatment of metabolic acidosis in patients who have got chronic kidney disease is to achieve a plasma or blood carbonate concentration equal to or greater than 22 millimoles per liter. So this is a flow chart which shows, just to simplify what we just discussed now, in a CKD patients, it is advised to go for bicarbonate measurement. If it is less than 22, oral sodium bicarb administration should be ordered. And for a patient, if they have a higher bicarbonate, and that means they have metabolic acidosis, they should be monitored at least once a year, and they should be followed up. but it should be given if the bicarb levels are less than 22 millimoles per liter. Now, what is the role of injectable form of sodium bicarbonate? I agree that its roles are limited. However, in patients who have got, in clinical practice, we do find a group of patients who have got severe metabolic alkalosis with acute kidney injuries, who actually definitely are deemed fit for or suitable for renal replacement therapies for various reasons, either social, financial, or their beliefs. Family members are not willing for dialysis. For these kind of patients, actually, we do end up using sodium bicarbonate. And other scenarios like cardiac arrest, where you think that is definite hyperkalemia, it is one of the drugs which is definitely recommended. Patients who have got tricyclic antidepressants, we are not going to discuss it in detail here. But in my clinical practice of last 17 years, in some cases, we have actually found that in patients who have developed acute kidney injuries and have got severe metabolic acidosis, and somehow if urine output is preserved, these are the cases if there is persistent metabolic acidosis which is hampering with your doses of the vasopressors or troubling the heart. These are the group of patients where it is worth trying giving at least 50 to 100 ml of sodium bicarbonate, follow their ABGs and sodium levels closely at a regular interval, at a shorter interval. And these are the group of patients in my experience, they have actually responded to this injectable form of sodium bicarbonate in form of giving, correcting their metabolic acidosis. When it is given, it is usually given as neat infusions in a 50 ml syringe, usually a bigger line like an extrajugular vein, or if you have got a central line, or if you are giving it through a peripheral line, usually it is mixed with the 5% dextrose solutions. Be aware of hypernatremia because it is a high osmolar solutions, and osmolarity is more than thousands. So you have to look for your sodium levels and osmolarities. So one of the uncommon entities that is those patients might be having, and it is often goes unnoticed or undiagnosed, is the renal tubular acidosis. This is usually defined as retention of acids and less of sodium bicarbonate in the bloodstream in the presence of relatively preserved glomerular filtration rate. So there is no demonstrable decrease in the GFR. But these patients, if you doing their blood gases, you might find there is acidosis in the blood and less bicarbonate. So they are broadly divided into 4 types: type 1, type 2, type 3, and type 4. And type 4 is the common one, which investigations we find in a clinical practice, usually in patients who have got diabetic nephropathy untreated for some time or drug-induced. So as I said, it's a relatively an uncommon entity, but in patients who you have unexplained metabolic acidosis in blood in presence of normal renal function test like urea creatinine is normal, this is something is definitely comes into the differential diagnosis. And one got to rule out urinary tract infections before we arrive at a diagnosis of renal tubular acidosis. And one has to ensure that sodium in the urine is around more than 25 millimoles per liter, because if suppose in a case of hypovolemia, there's a phenomenon of increased absorption of sodium from the urine. So that cases sodium tends to get more alkaline pH, and this might actually give a false diagnosis of renal tubular acidosis. So these are the exclusions that we have to make sure before we make a diagnosis of renal tubular acidosis. How do you treat? It is again symptomatic. You have to treat the cause first. Until then, oral alkali supplementations, as in cases of other metabolic acidosis related to kidney dysfunctions, in the dose of around 1 to 2 milligrams per kg per day. So summarizing, metabolic acidosis is most commonly found in patients with renal dysfunctions. Conservative management is preferred or advocated in mild to moderate cases. And in severe cases, one has to consider renal replacement therapy. There is an established role of sodium bicarbonate in stable chronic kidney diseases, and it does limit the progression of CKD or chronic kidney disease to end-stage kidney disease. There is limited role of sodium bicarbonate injections in severe metabolic patients, especially in patients with acute kidney injury, either primary acute kidney injury or acute or chronic kidney injuries. And renal replacement therapy, if deemed necessary, got to be instituted at an appropriate time, because suppose you think that patient is worsening, due to lack of logistics or manpower issues, if you're leaving this acidosis untreated till morning, which is common, happens in smaller centers. Actually, by the time the damage would have happened, the vasopressors usually go sky high, And when you start doing the renal replacement therapy, either a slow or limit dialysis or a CRRT, patients do not respond well. So it has to be instituted, it has to be given at an appropriate time. And the underlying cause, it is either sepsis or either it is diabetic ketoacidosis or dengue hemorrhagic shock, it has to be treated properly. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Sharmili, for that very elaborate presentation on acid-base disturbances in acute kidney injury. Just deviating a little bit from the main theme of the topic, you mentioned about sodium bicarbonate. If you go by the Stewart hypothesis, what I feel is the alkalinizing effect of soda bicarb may be largely because of the sodium itself, because it raises the sodium level, and thereby, as the sodium level rises, it widens the strong ion difference, and a wide strong ion difference means alkalosis. So this is one of the hypotheses behind the use of soda bicarbonate, sodium bicarbonate in clinical practice. I would like to listen to what others think about that as well. If there are any other questions, would you please ask? I can't see. There are some questions on lactate, but nothing on acid-base balance in acute kidney injury.
If there is no questions, can I just make a comment?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, a very eminent panelist here. So, I would like to rather understand from you, in your practice, where do you place the role of injectable sodium bicarbonate for a patient who has got severe metabolic acidosis?
In my practice, I really don't use soda bicarb in patients who have metabolic acidosis secondary to, say, sepsis or cardiogenic shock, or even postoperative cases, including postoperative cardiac surgery. That has not been my practice as a general rule. Occasionally, I have been forced to use it, maybe just to buy time in severe acidosis before you can actually start renal replacement therapy. Of course, it's a different matter if the acidosis is predominantly due to renal causes, not particularly due to, say, sepsis. Then, of course, if it's a primary renal cause, I might use sodium bicarbonate rather more liberally compared to, say, in a patient with sepsis. Would like to hear what others think too.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, sir, on this. But lately, in the last, 2 years, when we keep getting patients from peripheries, we are being a tertiary referral unit, and patients come at the varying stages of diabetic ketoacidosis with already acute kidney injury setting, and we find very strange blood gases. There is urine output is preserved. There is degree of moderate to severe metabolic acidosis, but the kind of hemodynamically stable, not so bad. And then the acidosis actually bothers. And these are the group of patients where we thought of using sodium bicarbonate. And a couple of patients actually they did respond and the pH normalizes. It's nothing that normalization was our goal. But somehow when it proceeds to moderate to severe acidosis, it's kind of become bothersome. And it's become very difficult to accept that kind of pH as a report. So those are the cases we found probably it works, but I'm not sure what worked. Maybe the base underlying etiology which was treated well, probably in the recovery process, it might have just got corrected. But also like to know, opinion of other seniors. I can see Dr. Rupkishan is on board. If you'd like to give his opinion.
Sorry, I'm just a very interested spectator. First of all, let me congratulate all of you. Absolutely fantastic presentations. My interest was sort of awakened because of the very first talk on Stewart. And then lactate was absolutely fascinating. And this treating acidosis in chronic kidney disease, again, it's sort of quite a minefield. It's very difficult to tell what exactly to do, but essentially it is just, I'm not a nephrologist, so I don't treat chronic kidney disease, or I haven't when I was professionally active. But in the acute kidney injury, it's almost always has been, they have needed renal replacement therapy sooner or later. So if there is metabolic acidosis that needs treating and hyperkalemia associated with it, probably the best thing is to go for RRT straight away. I have very rarely used bicarbonate. I know nephrologists, for certainly the renal tubular acidosis, they use bicarbonate. And as Jose was pointing out, I am partial to Stuart. So I believe that when you give bicarbonate to somebody, especially in acute situations, the sodium part of it is retained, whereas the bicarbonate is exhaled out. So it is just the widening of strong iron difference, which then has the alkalizing effect. My experience has been that all those winter formula and predicting bicarbonate and whatnot in acute situations is extremely difficult. It doesn't seem to follow any rules at all. So trying to predict what the bicarbonate should be and what it should not be, I found that it was extremely always difficult. And you do get very strange blood gas results. People who have got all sorts of derangements, but pH is normal, or the people's pH is not normal, but have got everything else seems to be okay. So you just got to treat each patient individually. That's as far as I can tell you.
That's very nice of you, Roop, to join in.
It's what I told you. It's the Stuart that drew me here.
I knew that Stuart would really draw you in. So that's good. And in fact, one of the other things that I've been seeing is, in acute kidney injury, the phosphate level rises quite a bit. It's not very often measured, not always measured. And phosphate being a weak acid would again tend to narrow down the strong iron difference and cause acidosis, which is possibly one of the predominant mechanisms in renal dysfunction.
Yeah, absolutely correct. Yeah.
Anything else?
There's a question I can see. Can I read that?
Yes, please.
Is there any significant difference in venous and arterial bicarbonate levels? So I would say not much significant. It is within 2 to 4. The reason that we the definition for the CKD group of patients has been advocated to have either venous or venous bicarbonate level is to avoid the arterial breaks. That is the reason, because they might be needing many times AV fistulas later on in their life. So it is usually advocated to not to do repeatedly prick their arteries to collect sample to estimate their bicarbonate level. So it is within 2 to 4 millimoles per liter. And there is another question, as Dr. Chacko just pointed out about phosphate. What about phosphate correction in CKD patients? Usually it is probably overlooked. And I'm not sure if phosphate is usually corrected in these patients, but sometimes I think in CKD patients, maintenance stable patients in the OPD basis, they do get some supplements if the phosphate levels, estimated levels are low. Is there a cutoff for pH for metabolic acidosis when you advocate using as a bicarbonate? There is no cutoff level for pH. As I said, it is usually moderate to strong, moderate to severe metabolic acidosis with more deteriorating organ dysfunctions. And when there is a delay in the starting the renal replacement therapies for various of reasons, in our socioeconomic status and place of practice, we find reasons being financials or patients' family not willing to dialysis. These are the scenarios where to buy time we use bicarbonate for a short period of time. Otherwise, in severe metabolic acidosis, usually one has to go for renal replacement therapy as soon as possible. And when you say moderate to severe metabolic acidosis, it is usually less than 7.2.
Okay, so shall we wind up, Saurabh, if you're there?
Question for
Yes,
Priyam.
Dr. Chacko.
There's
I
a
think
question
we
from
can.
Ma'am. There's a question from Priyam.
Okay.
Anirban was asking like that being an anion, why is not an acidifying agent?
Yeah, but Anirban, are you there? Yeah,
yes, Anirban,
you were there. Otherwise, you can, yeah, Anirban, or you can call me also. Your actually question got me thinking, right? I do not have the answer for your question right now, but how I understood your question, right?
Yes.
If you look into from Peter-Stewart approach, lactate is one of the factor of strong ion difference, right?
Right.
Okay. Now, if we see that if lactate is one of the factor of strong ion difference, then why Story did not include lactate in the calculation of sodium minus chlorine minus 35? We have used lactate as a separate equation, right?
Right.
Right. So actually it got me thinking tomorrow, not today, tomorrow I'll go and read that paper by Story et al. Again, and I'll try to find out, is there any, hint that was given to us? But what I can think here is that, see, lactate can change its quantity, to many magnitudes, right? Suppose from 1 or 2 normal, you can have a lactate of 10, 11, something like that is 5 times normal, 6 times normal. But that amount of change of magnitude within a pathological scenario, we do not see for sodium or calcium or magnesium. Probably that is the reason why, if we consider Stewart approach, the role that is played for acidification, if lactate is present, that too in a quite high number, is quite more compared to the effect that is because of maybe calcium, magnesium, or for that matter of fact, sodium also. Because from sodium, how much it will go? From 140, it will go to 160, right? If you see the percentage change, from 140 to 160 is not that much. If you see the percentage change of lactate from 2 to 10. Okay, right. So that is the reason why I think that lactate, though may directly, now there is a school of thought that it may not be responsible for the acidosis, lactic acidosis, but lactate itself, because of its quite high magnitude change of value, it can influence the acid-base system of the, according to Stewart. And in the meantime, I'd like to just bring to everybody's notice is that nowadays, because Stewart has said that SID, ATOT, and PCO2 are independent variable, we have now come to understand that actually these are not. This may be true for a biological system or a glass of water or something like that. But when we talk about human body, probably SID is not independent of CO2. CO2 may not be independent of SID, and that is probably what we have seen in the last paper that I have quoted. So very interesting things are coming up. So let's see, and let's catch up Anirban to discuss that.
Yes, actually, Priyamda, like I have a sort of idea about it. My question was slightly like not different. Why lactate was not included in the sodium minus chloride minus 35 is because it is an ion coming from a weak acid, lactic acid, and sodium and chloride, they are ions coming from strong acid or base. So that is there. What I could not understand is like the the explanation which was given that lactate is not responsible for acidosis is that with production of one lactate there are 2 hydrogen ions that are produced, which in a perfect system would get buffered by the mitochondria. But the presence of lactate in any solution, be it extracellular fluid or plasma, is by its inherent nature of the charge that is it has, will definitely acidify the solution, right?
Yes, that is what I also understand.
Yes. So
yes.
Yeah. So probably we are right if we say that lactate, the presence of lactate causes acidosis.
Yeah, that is what I also understand. That yes, and that is what we normally see in ABG also. Why in certain cases of hyperlactatemia we do not see the pH changing. Probably we'll have to look for other effects that are causing the alkaline resistance.
Yeah, one of the very important things to remember is, in the presence of high lactate, in septic patients, for instance, you may very often find that there is no acidosis. One of the reasons is because of the hypoalbuminemia, because by this time you indulge in very aggressive fluid resuscitation, and even otherwise the albumin levels come down to very low levels, and hypoalbuminemia will tend to neutralize the effect of lactate in at least in some situations. That's what I've noted.
Yes, sir.
Actually, there are lots, like almost 3 like definition of acid and base. So maybe in some in definition, lactate is a that can accept hydrogen ion. In that case, it may be base, right?
Right.
Right, sort of there is a very interesting, review article that was published. I forgot, maybe in the Bench to Bedside, the history of acid base. That's freely available, and if you see, then people are not actually sure what is an acid. That is what also I understood, and that is why I probably said in one of the, we are not even sure what is an acid.
Yeah. Yes, that's right.
Yeah, that is quite funny, in fact.
Okay, sir.
Shall we wind up?
Yes. Okay, sir. Thank you.
May I take this opportunity, Dr. Jose, to thank you very much for being with us and taking us through this wonderful session. And I think all the speakers have given so much to it that I have no words to express. So thank you, everybody. On behalf of our team at Artemis Hospital, thank you so much, Dr. Jose.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. It was my pleasure to be here this evening. Thanks to all the speakers and the audience.
You made it fabulous, sir.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, then. Good night.
Thank you, Dr. Reshma, Dr. Saurabh, Dr. Charco, and all my co-panelists and audiences. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharmili. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for your great presentations. Good night to you all.
Nice to have you here, Ruth.
Good night.
Good night.
Bye-bye. Bye.